Hello folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Here we have the 1796 British Light Cavalry Sabre. So this is a very popular sword. Lots gets spoken about it on the internet and in books, and it's sometimes quoted as being the best or one of the best cavalry swords ever to have been made or designed. So first thing to say about it, in 1796 there are actually 3 new models of sword which are brought out in the British Army, and this leads to some confusion in discussions online. There's the 1796 Sabre for light cavalry, which is this one, and then there's 2 other swords. This is the most famous of those, incidentally, but the 1796 Infantry officer's sword, which is a spadroon, and I sometimes show an example of one in other videos I've done here. So that's for infantry officers, that is officers on foot, and only officers, and sergeants actually as well. And then there's the 1796 heavy cavalry sword, which is very different to this. It has a more complete guard with a disc guard and a straight blade longer than this, and in fact it's the type of sword used by Sharp in the Sharp series and series of books, indeed by Bernard Cornwell. But this is the most famous of those 3. This is the 1796 Light Cavalry Sabre, and this was designed allegedly by John Gaspard Le Marchant, who was a cavalry general in the British Army during the Peninsular War. Very highly decorated, but he also wrote a manual on cavalry swordsmanship and essentially training cavalrymen. He got together with a sword maker or 2 and came up with this design. Now, it has been asserted that this is modelled on the Indian tulwar. I would utterly dispute that fact. I don't think it is at all, and in fact the blade is very different to Indian tulwar blades that predate this. It should be mentioned that after this, some Indian tulwars do in fact use this blade. Later on, about 50 years later, we find that Indian cavalrymen sometimes are reusing these old blades because they've been passed out of service by that point, largely, and mounting them on tulwar hilts. So these blades did get used on tulwars, but they are not modelled on tulwars. So it's actually the opposite way around to how most people explain it. Okay? Where does this blade come from? Well, that's an unknown really. John Gaspard Le Marchant was quite influenced by Austrian cavalry, and it's my opinion that this sabre is largely modelled on Eastern European and Central European sabre types. Okay, so it's characterised by a 32.5 or 33-inch blade. For the troopers model. This is actually an officer's version, and it is worth mentioning that for the 1796 heavy cavalry sword and light cavalry sword, there were officers' versions and normal cavalry troopers' versions. This is actually an officer's version, but it doesn't differ very much in this case from the troopers' version. Okay, so it's characterised by a broad, relatively broad curved blade, what's called a hatchet point. In other words, it's designed for cutting really. It's designed for cutting efficiency at the tip, not really designed for thrusting per se, although you can thrust with it to some extent. A broad, relatively deep fuller in the blade there to reduce the weight and maintain stiffness. So it's actually quite a light sword. Sometimes people assume that this is a heavy sword looking at it because it's broad, but in actual fact it's quite flat. So it starts off about 9mm thick at the base, but it has a lot of distal taper, and in the last part of the blade, I'll move out a bit, the last part of the blade, it's quite thin in fact and very flexible. So at the part of the blade that's actually passing through a target, i.e. this portion of the last foot of the blade, is really quite thin, which is great for sharpness, makes it easy to keep a sharp edge on the sword, a very fine edge, and of course less resistance passing through things. So it is a superb cutting sword, cuts very, very well, both with a direct hack, or indeed with the drawing cut or pushing cut type of cuts that you sometimes get used in Eastern and Asian swordsmanship. The hilt is characterised by this what's called a stirrup hilt here. It's a simple knuckle bow. So one of the only real criticisms of this model of sword was that it didn't protect the hand very well, and in fact the model that replaced this, the 1821 light cavalry sword actually had a 3-bar hilt, which I've shown in many of my other videos, that protects the hand a bit better. But this one is just a simple knuckle bow, so it doesn't offer a lot of protection to the hand. However, the knuckle bow that's there is very strong, and it's this kind of P shape stirrup hilt, as it's called. And that, why is it shaped like that? Well, we don't exactly know, but there is a few theories. One is that on impact it's less likely to cave in. It's more, because it curves out, it's more resistant to impact. Another possible reason is that when it's in the sheath, in the scabbard, it's quicker to get your hand in. It's less likely to fumble. If it was closer to the grip, it'd be maybe take a little bit longer to get your hand in, or you might accidentally grab it like that, or just not be able to get your hand in as quickly. So you can get your hand in quickly. Thirdly, it can enable you to hold the hand right down there, right at the pommel if you really want to, which can enable you to get the point more online or to reach a bit further. I'm a bit not so sure about that theory. And another possible theory, again I'm not 100% sure about this one, is the fact that if the blade is at this sort of angle and something does hit here, it will skip off and away from the sword arm. Yeah, semi-plausible, yeah, might be a reason. I tend to think that it's largely a sort of style, but combined with perhaps robustness thing. But those other factors I've mentioned may play a part. It has a slot in the end there, you can see, for the sword knot, as it's called, which is essentially a strap that you put your wrist through, so that if the weapon gets knocked out of your hand, it will just dangle off your wrist. I've done a video about sword knots previously. The handle is, you'll notice it's got what are called langets coming up the side here. So we have a back strap here going up to the pommel, one piece, and this obviously sandwiches the hilt together. And these little ears on the side there have a rivet passing through them. So it's actually a very strong hilt because it's peened at the end with the normal end of the tang. The tang passes through here and then is peened with a rivet at the end there. And then there's another rivet which passes right the way through the tang and through the grip. So it's actually a very robust, very tough hilt assembly that you've got on this 1796 sabre. Now, how is it as a sword? As a light cavalry sabre, it's superb. It was pretty much universally loved and respected and feared, and it was copied. Allegedly the French complained about it, although trying to pin down that as an actual sword with a source is somewhat difficult, and there's a whole thread on Sword Forum about it. But the Indian, as I've mentioned, the Indians like to reuse the blades on tulwar, hilts, and in fact French, at least a couple of French models of light cavalry sabre seem to sort of slightly emulate it, and indeed the design as a general design is seen in earlier sort of Austro-Hungarian and Polish sabres. Okay, so it was not a completely radical design by any means, but it was a very effective sword for light cavalry. On foot, it's not so great. It's quite a light sword. It only weighs about 2 pounds, about the same as an infantry officer's sword. But the point of balance, look how far that is from the grip. It's very, very far out. Now, one advantage of that is that's what gives it a lot of its cutting power, the fact that the point of balance is far from the hand. But the disadvantage of that is it makes it quite, I won't say cumbersome because it's light, but it doesn't make it, it's not very conducive to fencing on foot. For hacking away, hack and slash, brilliant, but if you're fencing, if you're fighting against people who are using quicker swords like spadroons or even basket-hilted broadswords, and indeed bayonets, I don't think this is the sword that you really necessarily want to pick. And it is worth mentioning that British infantry officers who started emulating these swords during the Peninsular War, they started carrying sabres instead of spadroons. Those flank officers' sabres tend to have a point of balance much closer to the hand than the cavalry version does. Okay, so to sum up, designed by John Gaspard Le Marchand in 1796, incredibly popular, incredibly widespread, and had a long period of use, and in fact saw a revival of use in the mid-19th century with Indian cavalry. Was used by Indians, re-hilted on tulwar hilts. Is fantastic as a cavalry sword. for cutting, not very good for thrusting, for giving point because it is so curved, and not fantastic on foot. But it is a lovely sword, and they are a thing of beauty, and you can see why they have the reputation that they do and why they're so popular. Cheers!